Brian Henry never imagined that his carefully constructed life rested on a foundation of lies. Beneath the glittering chandeliers, the polished smiles, and the prestige of Henry Plaza Hotel, a sinister reality lurked. Determined to uncover why his family's prized hotel teetered on the brink of ruin, Brian shed his tailored suits for the anonymity of a waiter's uniform. In the hushed murmurs of weary employees and the oppressive shadows of the back corridors, he uncovered truths that shook him to his core. These revelations threatened not only the legacy of his late father, but also his own life. Each discovery weighed heavier than the last. Time was slipping through his fingers, and with it the chance to salvage what remained of the hotel's fractured foundation. Brian was about to learn that the price of truth could be far greater than he ever imagined. Brian Henry stood at the staff entrance of Henry Plaza Hotel, nestled in the heart of downtown New York City. He adjusted the sleeves of the borrowed waiter's uniform, its coarse fabric foreign against his skin. This was the beginning of a month-long undercover journey. As the heir to a multi-million-dollar hotel empire, Brian had always existed on the other side of the operation, hosting galas, approving expansions, and making decisions from the comfort of a corner office far removed from the hotel floor. But now, as Brian Harper, a nameless new hire, he was stepping into the unknown to uncover the roots of his hotel's decline. The choice to go undercover wasn't made lightly. The hotel chain, which Brian inherited from his father, was facing a crisis. Profits were plummeting, guest satisfaction was abysmal, and whispers of internal mismanagement were growing louder. Matteo, the general manager, blamed the issues on external factors: shifting markets, inflation, and guest expectations. But Brian's instincts told him otherwise. Something deeper was festering within the walls of Henry Plaza Hotel. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the threshold into a part of the hotel he had never truly seen. The staff area was a stark contrast to the opulence of the lobby, cramped, dimly lit, and filled with the faint smell of overused coffee machines. The walls seemed to echo with unspoken grievances. This wasn't the world his father had envisioned for his employees. Brian's first day began unceremoniously. Judy, the head of personnel, barely glanced at him as she handed him his schedule. "You'll be working the evening shifts at the lobby bar," she said curtly. "Matteo likes everything done his way. Stay in line and you'll avoid problems." Her clipped tone hung in the air as Brian made his way to his post. The atmosphere in the bar mirrored the tension in the staff room. Workers moved with a robotic efficiency, their faces etched with fatigue. Brian noticed how quickly tasks were completed, but the employees' eyes told a different story, one of burnout and resignation. Something had drained the life out of this place. As the hours dragged on, the cracks in the operation became evident. Scott, the bartender, grew visibly irritated, snapping at waiters who brought drink orders. A seasoned server named Linda shuffled through her tasks with an air of defeat. Guests waited longer than usual for their orders, and Brian overheard their grumbling complaints. "That's the fourth drink returned this week," Scott muttered, slamming a glass onto the counter. "Matteo keeps cutting costs. We're using subpar ingredients. No wonder the guests are unhappy." Brian committed the bartender's words to memory. He'd long suspected that financial shortcuts were impacting the guest experience, but hearing it confirmed by staff hit differently. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something even more insidious was at play. When his shift ended, Brian headed to the staff cafeteria for a meal. The small room was filled with slumped shoulders and quiet sighs. The exhaustion was palpable. Picking at a stale sandwich, Brian noticed a young woman sitting across from him. Despite her worn uniform, her eyes held a flicker of resilience. "First day?" she asked, her half-smile cutting through the gloom. Brian nodded. "Yeah. Still figuring things out." "Grace," she said, extending her hand. "Been here 3 years. What's your name?" "Brian Harper," he replied, shaking her hand. "What's it really like working here?" Grace's smile faltered. She glanced around cautiously before leaning in. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's hard. Ever since Mateo became general manager, things have gone downhill." Grace's tone was tinged with both caution and frustration. Her words hinted at a reality far grimmer than what Brian had already seen. As they spoke, Brian realized she was his first true ally in the fight to uncover the truth. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time, Brian felt a spark of hope. Together, they might just have a chance to save Henry Plaza Hotel, not just for the staff, but for the legacy it represented. Things at Henry Plaza Hotel had been unraveling for some time. "He doesn't care about us, only about slashing expenses," Grace said, her voice laced with frustration. "We're short-staffed, overworked, and when something goes wrong, we're the ones who take the blame." Brian Henry felt a surge of anger rise within him, but forced himself to remain calm. "I've noticed things seem strained," he replied carefully. Grace let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't know the half of it. Mateo is ruthless. People are terrified of losing their jobs, so they stay quiet, keep their heads down, and do exactly what he demands. But this can't go on forever. We're all at our breaking point." Her words struck a nerve, igniting a growing sense of responsibility in Brian. These were his employees. This was his hotel, his family's legacy. And yet, the people who made it run were being crushed under the weight of poor leadership. Grace's account only confirmed what he had long suspected. Mateo was running the hotel into the ground, not only financially, but also emotionally, breaking the spirit of those who worked there. Before Brian could ask anything further, the cafeteria door burst open. Mateo strode in, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the room. His sharp gaze swept across the space with an air of disdain. When his eyes landed on Brian, they lingered for a brief, unsettling moment before moving on. "I need everyone back on the floor," Mateo barked, his voice cutting through the room. "No more breaks until these guests are taken care of." Grace sighed, rising from her seat with visible reluctance. She glanced at Brian, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Welcome to Henry Plaza Hotel," she murmured, before heading back to her shift. Brian watched her walk away, the words ringing in his ears. Mateo's presence had soured the room, leaving behind a palpable tension. As Mateo exited, Brian's thoughts raced. He had seen enough on his first day to know that Mateo was at the heart of the hotel's problems. But he also understood that this was only the surface of something much deeper. Brian had 30 days to uncover the full scope of the issues and figure out a plan to turn things around, all while keeping his cover intact. As he left the hotel that evening, his steps felt heavier with the realization of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about finances or guest satisfaction anymore. It was about people, real people, who were suffering under the weight of fear and mismanagement. Brian knew this mission would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But for the sake of the staff and the legacy his father built, he was determined to see it through. Returning for his second evening shift, Brian Henry couldn't shake the thoughts from the night before. His conversation with Grace had confirmed what he had dreaded most. The hotel's struggles weren't limited to finances. Mismanagement was suffocating Henry Plaza, and the weight of it all fell squarely on the employees' shoulders. As he slipped through the back entrance once more, Brian was met with the familiar hum of staff bustling to prepare for another busy evening. The air was heavy, the tension almost tangible. It lingered in the hurried footsteps, the clipped tones of conversation, and the way employees avoided meeting each other's eyes. Each task was executed with frantic energy, as if the act of stopping might cause everything to collapse. Brian could see it in their faces, fatigue etched in every line. These people were running on sheer willpower, and he feared it wouldn't hold for much longer. Taking his station at the lobby bar, Brian readied himself to observe more closely than ever. He knew he had to tread carefully. Matteo's hawk-like gaze seemed to sweep across every corner of the hotel, always on the hunt for dissent. If Brian was going to uncover the root of the problem and save Henry Plaza, he needed to witness the unvarnished truth, the good, the bad, and the moments no one dared to speak of. The first few hours passed in a blur of drink orders and cordial interactions with guests, but Brian's focus remained fixed on the staff. He watched how they operated under the mounting pressure, noting the cracks that quickly began to show. One employee in particular caught his attention, a young receptionist named Claire. From behind the bar, Brian had a clearer view of her station. Her hands flew across the keyboard as she managed a relentless stream of calls while simultaneously checking in guests. Her efficiency was impressive, but it came at a cost. Her posture was stiff, her shoulders hunched under invisible weight, and her voice carried an unmistakable tremor. By the second hour, the signs of strain were undeniable. The line at the reception desk stretched farther with each passing minute, and the phone seemed to ring without end. From his vantage point, Brian could see Claire's face grow increasingly pale. At one point, she paused, pressing her fingers to her temples in a futile attempt to stave off a headache. That's when Matteo appeared. "Claire!" he barked, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath as he stormed toward the desk, his expression dark with irritation. Claire jumped, visibly startled, and turned to face him. "I'm doing my best to keep up with the calls and check-ins," she stammered, her voice shaky. "It's just, there are only 2 of us on the desk tonight, and it's overwhelming." Matteo's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Overwhelming?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "Perhaps if you spent more time doing your job and less time whining, you wouldn't be falling behind." Brian felt a wave of anger boil beneath his composed exterior. From across the room, he watched Claire's face fall, her confidence crumbling under Matteo's scorn. Her eyes darted to the growing crowd of guests, who now watched the scene with awkward curiosity. "I wasn't complaining, Mr. Matteo," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I was just explaining that it's difficult to manage everything." Matteo leaned in slightly, his condescension evident in every movement. "Excuses won't fix anything, Claire. Either step up or step out. This hotel has no room for weak links." Brian clenched his fists under the bar, his resolve hardening. Matteo's harshness wasn't just demoralizing, it was toxic. The man's treatment of the staff made it painfully clear why morale was at an all-time low. But this moment only deepened Brian's determination. He wasn't just here to observe, he was here to fix what Matteo had broken. As Matteo turned on his heel and marched away, Claire took a deep breath, forcing herself to return to her work. Her movements were robotic, but the spark of pride and purpose she had when she first started her shift was gone. Brian knew that something had to change before this toxic environment consumed everyone in the hotel. This wasn't just about saving Henry Plaza's reputation or financial stability anymore. It was about restoring humanity and dignity to the people who made the hotel thrive. The path forward would be long and complicated, but Brian Henry wasn't going to let Matteo's cruelty define the legacy his father had built. Matteo loomed over Claire, his presence suffocating, his voice cutting like a blade. "Let me make something very clear," he hissed, leaning in so close that Claire instinctively recoiled. "If you can't handle the job, I'll find someone who can. Is that understood?" Claire nodded silently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Matteo straightened, his expression cold and unyielding, before turning sharply and walking away. The confrontation had lasted mere seconds, but its impact lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Claire's shoulders sagged as she returned to her tasks, her hands trembling as she resumed typing. From his post at the bar, Brian Henry watched the entire exchange, anger coursing through him like fire. This was exactly what Grace had warned him about. Mateo didn't just lead poorly, he ruled with fear, wielding his authority like a weapon. To him, the staff weren't people, they were expendable. Brian's fists clenched tightly beneath the counter, his knuckles whitening as he fought the urge to intervene. He wanted to step in, to tell Mateo to back off, to remind him that these employees were the heart of Henry Plaza. But he couldn't risk blowing his cover. For now, he had no choice but to stay silent and bide his time. Later that evening, as the bar quieted during a lull in the service, Brian slipped away. He needed answers, and he knew where to find them. The staff cafeteria was sparsely populated by the time he arrived, but he immediately spotted Grace sitting alone at a corner table. A half-eaten sandwich rested in front of her, forgotten as she scrolled absently through her phone. Brian approached cautiously, pulling up the chair across from her. Grace glanced up, her tired eyes softening into a faint smile. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone more resigned than curious. "You could say that," Brian replied, lowering himself into the seat. He cast a quick glance around the room to ensure no one was close enough to overhear. "I saw what happened with Claire earlier. Mateo was completely out of line." Grace scoffed, her smile fading. "That's just Mateo. Out of line is his default. He thrives on keeping everyone on edge, making sure no one feels secure." Brian leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "How long has this been going on?" Grace sighed, pushing her sandwich aside as if she'd lost her appetite. "Since he took over, really. At first it was just small things, cutting shifts, slashing the budget for supplies, annoying but manageable. Then it escalated. He started getting more aggressive, firing people for speaking up, transferring others to worse positions if they couldn't keep up. Now most of us are too afraid to say anything. We just keep our heads down and pray we don't end up on his radar." Brian felt his chest tighten with frustration. This was worse than he had feared. Mateo wasn't just mismanaging Henry Plaza, he was systematically draining the life out of it. The toxic environment he had fostered was breaking down the staff's morale, replacing hope with fear. If this continued, it wouldn't just be the employees who suffered. The entire hotel would crumble under the weight of such dysfunction. Everyone knew. It was tempting to say hope in Los Angeles needed to push down on labor forces before May. Grace shook her head, her voice soft but edged with bitterness. "I used to love working here. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like a family. Now, it's like walking on eggshells every day. No one smiles anymore. No one even laughs. We just survive." Brian leaned back, exhaling deeply as he processed her words. This wasn't just about saving a hotel. It was about saving the people who had poured their hearts into making Henry Plaza what it was supposed to be, a place of warmth, community, and pride. Mateo had stripped that away, leaving behind a shell of what his father had built. "I'm going to fix this," Brian said quietly, his tone resolute. Grace's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, her tired expression softened into something resembling hope. "You've got your work cut out for you," she said, her voice low but earnest. Brian nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "I know, but I won't let him destroy this place, not if I can help it." As the conversation ended, Brian knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Mateo's grip on the hotel was strong, and fear had taken root in the hearts of the staff. But Brian also knew that change was possible. If he could uncover the full extent of Mateo's damage and rally the team, there was still a chance to rebuild Henry Plaza, not just as a hotel, but as a home for everyone who worked there. "I've heard some people talking about leaving," Grace admitted, her voice dropping to a somber tone. "But finding work in this city, especially in hospitality, isn't easy. Most of us feel trapped, just trying to get by." Brian Henry frowned, his thoughts racing. If Mateo's leadership was pushing employees to the breaking point, Henry Plaza was already teetering on the edge of collapse. Losing seasoned staff would only make the situation worse. Replacing them with inexperienced workers would lead to a cascade of issues: poorer service, more complaints, and an even bleaker atmosphere. As the quiet between them stretched, Brian's mind drifted to memories of his father. Henry Plaza Hotel had once been a beacon of excellence. Guests came to bask in its charm and experience the pinnacle of service. His father had built the hotel from scratch, ensuring that every employee felt valued and respected. It was a place where people wanted to work, a family, not just a business. But now, that legacy was being eroded by a man who cared more about dominance and profit margins than the very people keeping the hotel afloat. "I don't know how much longer we can go on like this," Grace whispered, breaking the silence. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her tray, a reflection of the tension she carried. "Something has to change." Brian met her gaze, his resolve crystallizing. "It will," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Soon." As the evening progressed, Brian returned to his station at the bar, though his mind was far from the task at hand. He had seen enough. Mateo was the root of the problem, and if Henry Plaza was going to survive, Mateo's reign would have to end. But this wasn't just about removing one man from power. The rot ran deeper than that. The hotel's entire culture had shifted under Mateo's leadership, and reversing the damage would require more than just a change in management. Brian knew what had to be done. First, he needed to win the trust of the staff. Without their support, any efforts to turn things around would be futile. He had to understand what they truly needed, what they feared, what they hoped for, and find a way to address those concerns. Most critically, he needed to remain under the radar. Revealing his true identity now would jeopardize everything. As the night wound down, Brian wiped the bar clean, his motions mechanical as his thoughts swirled. From across the room, he felt the weight of a gaze. Mateo stood near the entrance, his sharp eyes locked on Brian. The expression on Mateo's face was hard to read, but there was something calculating in his stare that made Brian's stomach tighten. Mateo was suspicious. He wasn't the kind of man to overlook unfamiliar faces or unexplained actions. Brian turned his attention back to the bar, careful not to let his unease show. He couldn't afford to slip up. If Mateo uncovered the truth about who he really was, Brian's mission would end before it even began. But Brian wasn't about to give up. This was his family's legacy, a hotel his father had poured his heart and soul into creating. Brian wouldn't let Mateo destroy it, not without a fight. The following evening, Brian Henry arrived at Henry Plaza with a heightened sense of purpose. Every day, as Brian Matthews, felt like a balancing act, one wrong move away from exposing his true identity. After his conversation with Grace the night before, his determination had only grown. This wasn't just about Mateo's mistreatment of the staff. It was about uncovering the deep-seated fear and frustration that had seeped into the hotel's foundation. If Brian could get to the bottom of it, he might have a chance to turn things around. Brian's shift began as usual. He wiped down tables in the bar, carried trays of drinks, and greeted guests with the polished ease he had cultivated over years in hospitality. But his focus was elsewhere, his eyes scanning the room, his ears tuned to the subtle tensions lingering in every interaction. The signs of strain weren't hard to find. While clearing a table near the front desk, Brian's attention was drawn to a tense exchange unfolding nearby. Judy, the head of personnel, stood with her arms crossed, her posture rigid as she addressed a small group of housekeepers. Her voice, low but cutting, carried a sharpness that made Brian pause. "I don't care how many rooms you're assigned," Judy snapped. "We're understaffed and all rooms must be spotless for the weekend. If that means staying late, then stay late." An older housekeeper, Betty, stepped forward, her frustration evident in her trembling hands. "We've been working overtime every day this week," she said, her voice weary yet firm. "We're completely drained. You can't keep treating us like this." Judy's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing in irritation. "I'm not here to listen to excuses," she replied coldly. "You're paid to work, so work. If it's too much for you, there's the door." Brian's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. Judy's dismissive tone and icy demeanor struck a nerve. These were hard-working employees, exhausted, overburdened, and clearly nearing their breaking point. Betty's face was etched with fatigue, her grip tightening around her cleaning supplies as if they were the only thing keeping her grounded. "We're doing everything we can," Betty continued, her voice tinged with desperation. "But we need more hands. We're stretched too thin, and we can't keep this pace." Judy barely blinked. "Maybe if you focused on working faster, we wouldn't have this issue," she retorted. Her words landed like a blow, cutting through the fragile resolve of the group. A heavy silence followed. The housekeepers exchanged glances, their frustration and exhaustion written across their faces, but none dared to challenge Judy further. Her authority, coupled with an underlying threat of retaliation, kept them quiet. Brian's hands tightened on the tray he was carrying, his anger simmering just below the surface. He couldn't step in. Not yet. Revealing his identity at this stage would jeopardize everything. But watching Betty and the other housekeepers bear the brunt of a failing system made his restraint almost unbearable. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was cruelty. Judy's complete disregard for the well-being of her team was a glaring symptom of the toxic culture Matteo had cultivated. These employees were the backbone of Henry Plaza, and they were being treated as though they were disposable. As Brian returned to his tasks, his mind churned with ideas. Fixing this hotel would require more than just removing Matteo or Judy. It would take a fundamental shift in how the staff were valued and supported. They needed to know they weren't just cogs in a machine, but integral members of the Henry Plaza family his father had worked so hard to build. Later that evening, as the shift wound down, Brian made a quiet vow to himself. He wasn't just here to watch the hotel crumble. He was here to rebuild it, piece by piece, starting with the people who had been ignored for far too long. Brian Henry clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. Acting impulsively wouldn't help, not yet. He needed to gather more information before making a move, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to intervene. As the housekeepers shuffled away, their spirits visibly crushed, his eyes caught Betty's for a fleeting moment. In that brief exchange, he saw the raw exhaustion etched into her face. This wasn't just a group of employees struggling under heavy workloads. These were people being ground down by a system that had stripped them of hope. Brian made a mental note to speak with Grace later. She seemed to have a keen understanding of the undercurrents at Henry Plaza. If anyone could give him a clearer picture of the toxic environment, it was her. Later that evening, Brian found himself back in the dimly lit staff break room, hoping to steal a quiet moment with Grace. He didn't have to wait long. She walked in a few minutes later, her expression worn, but her eyes still glimmering with a quiet determination. "Tough shift?" Brian asked, offering her a steaming cup of coffee from the machine. Grace accepted the cup with a small, appreciative smile. "Always," she replied, her tone tinged with a weary humor. "And you? Adjusting to life as a waiter?" Brian shrugged, keeping his demeanor casual. "It's different, but I'm managing." The silence that followed was filled with the low hum of the vending machine, yet Brian could sense an unspoken weight lingering in the air. Grace seemed preoccupied, her gaze distant. "What's really happening here, Grace?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. "It's not just about long hours and budget cuts, is it?" Grace hesitated, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup as she stared into its depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost as if she feared being overheard. "It's Matteo. He's not just a bad manager. He's dangerous. He's been pushing everyone past their breaking point for months. Staff cuts, wage reductions, and constant threats. It's unbearable." Brian leaned forward, his focus sharpening. "Dangerous how?" Grace glanced around the room, her wariness palpable. "I've seen him fire people over the smallest mistakes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's created this culture of fear. No one dares to speak up because they know Matteo will retaliate, and it's not just him. Judy's his enforcer. She's always there, backing him up, making sure no one steps out of line." Brian's jaw tightened as her words sank in. This was far worse than he had initially suspected. Matteo wasn't simply an incompetent leader driving the hotel toward financial ruin. He was actively creating a hostile and oppressive work environment. The staff weren't just struggling, they were living in fear. "Has anyone tried to report him?" Brian asked, his voice low but urgent. "What about Marvin or HR?" Grace let out a bitter laugh. "HR?" she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Judy is HR. She and Matteo make sure every complaint gets buried before it reaches anyone who could actually help. And if someone tries to push back, they're out of here faster than you can blink. Nobody's willing to take that risk anymore." Brian's thoughts raced. This was no longer just about restoring Henry Plaza's reputation or salvaging its operations. It was about protecting the people who worked here, people like Grace, Betty, and Scott, who were being systematically crushed under Matteo's ruthless leadership. He looked at Grace, her exhaustion clear, but her resolve unbroken. "This can't go on," he said firmly. Grace met his gaze, her eyes steady despite the weight of everything she'd just shared. "I know," she said quietly, "but unless someone does something soon, it's only going to get worse." Brian nodded, his determination hardening into resolve. This wasn't just his father's legacy at stake. It was a fight for the dignity and well-being of every person who called Henry Plaza their workplace, and he wasn't about to back down. Brian Henry sat quietly, absorbing everything Grace had shared with him. If her account was accurate, and he had no reason to doubt her, it painted a grim picture of Matteo and Judy's iron grip over Henry Plaza. They had built a fortress of fear and manipulation, one that wouldn't easily crumble. "I don't know how much longer I can stay here," Grace admitted, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I used to be so proud to work here. It felt like we were part of something special. Now, every day feels like a fight just to survive." Brian nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. He wanted to reassure her, to promise that change was coming, but he couldn't reveal who he really was, not yet. The time to expose his identity and take action hadn't arrived. "Hold on, Grace," he said gently, his tone steady. "Things will change, I promise." She offered a faint, weary smile, one that barely masked the weariness in her eyes. "I hope you're right," she replied softly. The remainder of Brian's shift passed without incident, but Grace's words stayed with him like a haunting refrain. As he cleaned the bar at closing, her frustration replayed in his mind. Matteo and Judy weren't just bad managers, they were dismantling the very spirit of the hotel. Piece by piece. Removing them from their positions would be a critical step, but it wouldn't solve the deeper issues. The entire culture of fear, silence, and oppression they had cultivated would need to be dismantled. Walking through the quiet lobby on his way out, Brian's eyes were drawn to a familiar figure near the front desk. Matteo stood there, his arms crossed and his expression dripping with authority, while Judy stood by his side. Their conversation was hushed, but their body language exuded smug confidence. They believed their power over Henry Plaza was absolute, that they were untouchable. Brian clenched his fists, the sight fueling his resolve. These two had turned his family's legacy into a place of fear, breaking the spirits of the very people who made the hotel run. But their reign wouldn't last much longer. Brian couldn't let them destroy everything his father had built with such care and integrity. The path forward was clear. He needed to gather evidence. It wasn't enough to witness the damage. They needed proof. undeniable and solid. He needed to uncover how deeply Mateo's corruption ran, how far Judy's complicity stretched, and what strategies would be required to take them down. All of this had to be done without jeopardizing his cover. Stepping out into the cool night air, Brian's mind churned with plans. He glanced up at the glowing lights of Henry Plaza, a place that once symbolized excellence and community. He couldn't stand idly by while it was torn apart. The road ahead was daunting, but Brian Henry wasn't one to shy away from a fight. Quietly, he would lay the groundwork. Slowly, he would pull apart Mateo's fortress, brick by brick. The battle for Henry Plaza had begun, and Brian was determined to win.